All right, welcome again to the Chicago Research Summit. I'm going to introduce very briefly so we have as much time as possible for the presentation. Let's welcome Gerald Butters, Professor of History at Aurora University. He will be presenting on Black stand-up comics in Chicago, Navigating a Changing City, 1955 to 1970.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'd like to dedicate my presentation this morning to Dr. Timeo Black, who was actually a mentor of mine. So the relationship between desegregation and the stand-up comedy circuit in the mid-20th century is a complicated one. Community racial practices, venues available for Black performers, and generational breakout buzz led to historical patterns that were not necessarily linear. What I'm attempting to do is to explore the careers of Black stand-up comics in Chicago from 1955 to 1970, who were attempting to navigate a rapidly changing industry. Now, in the mid-1950s, African-American comic talent could only perform in Black-only venues on the south side of the city. The cultural expectation was that these comics' work was so racially and culturally specific that only Black Chicago audiences would attend their shows. Within 15 years, though, Black comedians were playing in clubs all over the city, appearing at the major cultural institutions of the Loop, plying their trade regularly on commercial television, and making frequent public appearances at charity events. For Black comics who'd begun under the strict racial parameters of the 1940s and 1950s, this meant quick, nimble adjustment in order to maintain career longevity and visibility. As many of Chicago's Black venues closed, new desegregated ones open, and Black comedians had to try to consider how they fit into the city's new comedic landscape, the demographic composition of their audiences, and the spaces in which they perform. Now, Chicago earned an international reputation as a city that bred comedians. African-American comics had been performing in Chicago since the beginning of the 20th century. Black entertainers were mostly banned from white establishments. Thus, a burgeoning entertainment industry that catered to Black Chicagoans emerged in the early part of the century. Theaters, including the Regal and the Savoy, and nightclubs throughout the South Side catered to a largely African-American clientele. By the early 1950s, attendance figures at the Regal were as high as 125,000 people a week. Therefore, it's impossible to talk about the history of stand-up comedy in Chicago without centering African-American comic traditions. Now, the Regal and the Savoy were among the Chitlin Circuit's stalwart establishments, a collection of venues throughout the upper Midwest, eastern, and southern parts of the United States that offered performance opportunities for African-American comedians, musicians, and entertainers. The Chitlin Circuit was key to African-American entertainment in the early to mid-20th century. Segregation and racial discrimination prohibited Black entertainers from performing in many theaters throughout the nation. Therefore, the circuit created performance spaces in which they could demonstrate their artistry. Black performers often played weekend or weekly stints at a venue on the circuit before moving on to the next location. Tied into this circuit were several Chicago performance spaces, including well-established theaters, clubs, and lounges on the South Side. For Black comedians and performers, there was serious money to be made with Black Chicago audiences. African-American comedians were constantly on the road and had to be nimble and agile in determining what performance spaces would improve their careers. Now, Black comedians could perform in several entertainment spaces in the post-World War II era, but the most prestigious by far was the Regal Theater at 4719 South Parkway. American singer-songwriter Ruth Brown argued that a Black artist needed to play at 4 specific theaters nationally to prove that they had made it. And one of those was the Regal in Chicago. The Regal, which held over 3,000 seats, was built in 1928 as part of a larger commercial center in the heart of Chicago's Black Belt, a series of Chicago South Side neighborhoods that contained 75% of Chicago's Black population. Originally part of the Balaban and Katz chain, the theater produced its own stage shows and hosted touring vaudevillian acts, musicians, comedians, and variety shows. In fact, by 1959, stage shows were coming back to life at the Regal as the management brought in big name musicians. Many top Black comedians were added to the bill, creating a true variety act. The Regal's major competition was the Tivoli Theater at 6523 South Cottage Grove Avenue in Chicago's Woodlawn neighborhood. Designed by the architects Rapp and Rapp, the Tivoli was just as ornate as the Regal, with a painted ceiling in the lobby meant to resemble the Sainte-Chapelle in Versailles. The Tivoli was even larger than the Regal at 3,250 seats, but it had largely become a movie house by 1955, although stage shows played the venue occasionally. Both the Regal and the Tivoli were Chicago's top performance spaces for Black comedians throughout 1960. Always part of a variety act, comedians played before thousands of Black Chicagoans and created a relationship with their audience. The Regal and the Tivoli were segregated spaces where Black comedians could speak directly to Black audiences without the fear of offending white audience members. The establishment of this relationship was crucial to the longevity of a career. Prior to 1970, lounges, clubs, and bars that catered to Black Chicagoans were the spaces where Black stand-up comics could hone their craft. Among the most prominent was Robert's Show Lounge, situated at 6622 South Parkway. The lounge was associated with a motel since most downtown hotels did not allow Black travelers in the 1950s and early 1960s. The lounge existed between 1954 and 1961 and was founded by entrepreneur Herman Roberts. His 500 room, which also hosted Black traveling entertainers, was a hall in another one of his motels, opening in 1969 and closing in 1992. Other Black dominant venues that African-American comedians played at in the 1950s and 1960s included the Sutherland Lounge at 47th and Drexel, the Apex Club in Robbins, McKee's Disc Jockey Lounge at 6325 Cottage Grove, and the new CNC Lounge at 6513 Cottage Grove, among other businesses that had either short lives or haphazardly featured Black comics. These establishments were often proving grounds for upcoming Black comedians at the Sutherland Lounge. So here's kind of my thesis in a part of a larger work that I'm doing. I argue that there are three patterns of geographically situated performance for comedians in Chicago during the period 1955 to 1970. I call these traditional, transitional, and contemporary. Traditional entertainers included people like Moms Mabley. They performed at exclusively Black venues on the South Side during most of this period of time. Their comedy spoke directly to Chicago's Black community, and there was a distinct emotional connection between comedian and audience. The second category were transitional entertainers. They cut their teeth at Black venues in Chicago only to rapidly maneuver into white nightclubs in the early 1960s. Examples there included Dick Gregory, Nipsey Russell, and Godfrey Cambridge. Although they increasingly played a desegregated or white dominant audience, they were still known as Black comedians to club promoters and those who wanted to be entertained. Contemporary comedians included Bill Cosby, who had little to no experience playing Chicago's Black venues, although he was popular with Black Chicago audiences. After 1962, his comedy almost entirely avoided race, giving him the reputation as a more universal comedian. His safe comedy endeared him to white audiences, but his rapid career projection also established him as a success to Black Chicagoans. Now I'm going to spend some time actually talking about Moms Mabley. She's a fascinating woman. She's emblematic of the traditional categorization of Black comics who began performing in the early mid 20th century, when opportunities for Black comedians were restricted to segregated spaces. She's considered to be the first great American comedian. Born as Loretta Mary Aiken in 1894, but known primarily by her stage name Jackie Moms Mabley, she's known for the longevity of her career and because she was one of the few Black women who performed stand-up comedy in the early to mid 20th century. Mabley began her career on stage in the 1920s and became a veteran of the Chitlin circuit. One of the first openly queer comedians, by the mid-1950s, Mabley appeared on stage as a toothless woman in a house dress and a floppy hat. She used vulgarity and frequent risque references to critique sexuality, gender roles, and racism within American culture. But on stage, Moms was no black mammy. The comic mammy trope was brassy, large, and catered to the white world. Moms, on the other hand, was sexualized, joked about her love for younger men, and she was firmly in control of the stage. She was wildly popular with black audiences in Chicago, and Terrence Tucker claims Mabley sought to go beyond mere entertainment. Her acts were equal parts celebration, cultural sharing, and elderly advice. Moms spoke to her audience in the vernacular of the neighborhood, equal parts loving and ribald and quintessentially black. Mabley appeared in, Mabley appeared, I'm going backwards, I'm sorry. There we go. In several spaces that catered specifically to Black Chicago communities in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Theater historian Clovis Sims argues that Mabley was a favorite on the Regal stage. She initially appeared on the Regal in the 1930s and maintained a close relationship with the theater. The independent Regal Theater and its direct competitor, the Tivoli Theater, each produced elaborate stage shows in 1959. In July, the Regal had a high-profile variety act with singers like Tommy Edwards and Ernestine Anderson, vocal group Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross, a jazz orchestra, a magic act, and Moms Mabley. Mabley was a savvy entertainer. She knew when to transform opportunities into continued success. Two other essential factors besides her live performances played into Mabley's long-lasting relationship with Black Chicago audiences. First, she recorded 5 spoken word comedy albums between 1960 and 1961. Now, this was a relatively new phenomenon in the early 1960s, and her first album, Moms Mabley on Stage, released by Chess Records, earned the comedian a gold record and further boosted her national prominence. Second, in August of 1961, Moms appeared at Chicago's Bud Billiken Parade, the largest African-American parade in the United States. Driving in a convertible, Moms waved to the more than 25,000 patrons that lined the parade route. The parade, held annually since 1929, is both a type of back-to-school celebration and also a celebration of Black Chicago culture, with celebrities, sports figures, and entertainers often participating in the more than 3-hour parade. Mabley appearing at the Robert Show Lounge at the time of the parade solidified her relationship with the Black Chicago community by participating in this event. In 1962, with her popularity rising, Moms performed at all of the Black venues in Chicago, literally. She began the year at the Regal in the All-Star Review of 1962. She then moved to the Robert Show Lounge and eventually at the Tivoli, demonstrating how much she was loved at the time. Now, Moms's career skyrocketed with her television appearance on the ABC show A Time for Laughter, a look at Negro American humor in America. Produced by Harry Belafonte, the program featured Mabley at her best, and she was much in demand for the rest of the decade. The Smothers Brothers, The Merv Griffin Show, among many other television shows, featured Mabley. As a result, her performance venues became larger and more distinctly outside of Black Chicago neighborhoods. In November of 1967, she appeared at the Civic Opera House as part of a Thanksgiving Eve jazz festival. She followed this with shows at the Memorial Hall in Gary, Indiana in 1967 and the Auditorium Theater in 1968. Now, during the 1960s, Moms Mabley made the transition to mainstream notoriety and began performing at integrated or white-dominant performance spaces. I argue there's 3 societal shifts that made this national projectile possible for Mabley. First, society caught up with her material. While white stand-up comic Lenny Bruce was arrested on obscenity charges in Chicago in 1962, what was acceptable on the stage dramatically increased in scope in the 1960s as the judicial system increasingly supported First Amendment rights of speech on the stage. Moms Mabley's stand-up comedy for much of her career in the 1950s and early 1960s had been considered raunchy, but it was looked upon as cutting edge in the 1960s. Because she performed at mostly Black venues, the Chicago Police Department was less interested in the content of her acts, let's say, compared to Bruce. Second, the civil rights movement had pushed for integration in all aspects of American life. While it was possible for Black comics to perform for integrated audiences prior to 1963, these venues became open later in the decade. Now, the most prestigious performance space in Chicago for comics in the 1950s and 1960s was Mr. Kelly's right here. It was literally a springboard to fame for many entertainers in comics. The restaurant club sat on the corner of Rush Street and Bellevue Place in the city's north side. Comedian Tom Dreesen argues that Mr. Kelly's was the place where all the big comedians and singers from all over the world, whom you might see on the Ed Sullivan Show, would perform. It was the ultimate space for those who wanted a career in show business. The venue was also surprisingly open in regard to race. Della Reese, Ella Fitzgerald, and Sarah Vaughan all recorded live albums there in 1958. In 1959, Mr. Kelly's began a new policy of combining a musical act with comedic act. And this paved the way for rising comics to get fast notoriety. But Moms Mabley did not make her Mr. Kelly's debut until 1970. Much can be read into this fact that an elderly Black woman wasn't the image of a normal stand-up comic in the 1960s, that she was too connected to the Black community and largely unknown to white powers that be, or that white dominant audiences simply wouldn't be interested in going to her show. The third factor that impacted the traditional comedians was the demise of Black performance spaces. The Tivoli Theater closed in 1963 and was raised to make way for a parking lot and supermarket in August of 1966. The last stage shows for the Regal Theater took place in 1968 when it was finally closed. It was heavily damaged by a suspicious fire in 1971, torn down in 1973. The performing spaces, which had been the mainstays of Moms Mabley's career and other Black entertainers' careers, simply ceased to exist, thus forcing comedians to adjust if they were going to survive. Moms often opened her act by greeting her guests. "Thank you, children. Thank you, darlings," illustrating a direct intimacy that she had with her audience that connotated a familial connection. She also spoke in a vernacular that was indicative of the Black working class dialect. Now, traditional comics like Moms spoke directly to her Black audience and really made no attempt to cross over until it was absolutely necessary in the 1960s. Due to the strict racial patterns of this era, these comics knew their audience was Black and spoke in a language and addressed issues that mattered to them. Do I have time?
It's 9:52, so maybe a few more minutes, and then we can leave a few minutes for questions.
Let me just talk a little bit about Nipsey Russell, because I think I think I've got a story about what happened to him that I think is really important. Nipsey Russell really became very prominent in 1959. He was doing a show. He was the secondary act to Sammy Davis Jr. Now, I consider him a transitional comedian because he actually began a stage act with film comedian Mantan Moreland in 1952. In the 1950s, he played the Black Chicago club circuit for the rest of the decade, but his big break was at the Robert Show Lounge in 1959 when he was the comic relief for Sammy Davis Jr., who was a huge star at the time. The popularity of Davis literally changed the demographics of the lounge during his booking. They were playing to 90% white audiences who seldom, who ever went to the South Side. So comedian Dick Gregory reported the club was packed with white executives. Russell opened the show with a lot of racial comedy, and they couldn't laugh hard enough. Russell literally stole the show from Sammy Davis Jr. that night and was called to play for a group of white club owners downtown the following Monday, 2 days later. Contemporary Dick Gregory reported it was the exact same routine that had killed the customers at the Roberts Lounge, but that night Nipsey just sat up there and he died. Dick Gregory came to the conclusion that at the Roberts Show Lounge, which had the reputation of being a Black club, the white customer is, quote, filled with guilt and filled with fear. Downtown, though, it was the white man's house, and the white man felt comfortable and secure. He didn't have to laugh at racial material that he didn't want to hear. Nipsey Russell was obviously stunned by this development, and he had to instantly consider his material if he was going to play to integrated audiences. And Dick Gregory reported that he personally did not adjust his own act, but Nipsey Russell removed almost all of the racial comedy from his routine when he would play at for integrated audiences in clubs on the North Side and downtown, really for the rest of the 60s and 70s. Thank you for giving me time.
Thank you, Professor Butters. If anyone has a question, why don't you add it to the chat, and then I can read it. We have a few minutes here, about 5 minutes. As we're waiting, maybe as people are typing questions, I can start with a question.
Okay, here.
I'm curious that this is fascinating research here. Have you incorporated this into teaching at all, or is it a part of your work, like in the classroom here, or is this for a book project?
Well, it's actually does double duty. I teach our senior seminar where our students have to do a major research paper by the time that they complete their history degree. And this is just about that long. It's about 25 pages. So I use it as a model on how to incorporate Chicago history and how to do original research with primary sources. It's also part of a book project that it's called Rolling Mediated Comedy. It's going to be produced by Indiana University Press, and actually Al Martin is the editor of that.
Great. Are there any questions in the final minutes? I guess if there's not, I know you mentioned before you had more material than a 20-minute session. Is there anything else you'd want to share in the final 3 or 4 minutes?
Well, it's interesting that Bill Cosby, was arguably the biggest comedian, Black comedian in the 1960s and 1970s, maybe with the exception of Richard Pryor. And I have yet to find him playing a Black venue in Chicago in all the research that I did. He was similar to Nipsey Russell in that he did racially themed comedy up until about 1962. And then he was told by his manager to immediately cut it out. And he did so, and then he began to rise to prominence pretty much after that. But what propelled him was his television show I Spy. So he literally went from playing very, very small venues to being at the Auditorium Theater in just a matter of a couple of years.
We have not a question, but a comment of thanks for your research. And I think I can speak for all of us to say thank you for that. Thank you for sharing with us. We're going to end this session now, and you can move on to the next one in your schedule. Like I mentioned before, this is recorded. So if you want to refer back to it, we'll be posting them before too long. So thank you, Dr. Butters, for your presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.